Hi everyone and welcome to this video with me. I'm Rose, I'm from Minerva, and for today's video we'll be doing a Vikisews Cheryl Jacket. And we're pairing it with some cotton sateen quilted fabric. It's a Minerva Exclusive fabric. It's a really nice, lovely pattern and a brilliant fabric to use for this pattern. So we'll have a quick look at the pattern and we'll have a look at the fabric, take you through some properties of the fabric and the other bits and pieces that you need for this pattern. So what's nice about Vikisews patterns is they actually come in a box and they don't actually have instruction sheets inside them. You scan in the QR code and this takes you to the document online. It's nice if you don't like having bits and pieces of instructions floating around all over your sewing room. So that's a really nice quality to the Vikisews patterns. So the Cheryl Jacket is an oversized jacket and it comes in sizes extra small to extra large. But because it's oversized, there's quite a bit of leeway there in the sizes that you can have. And because, you know, it's nice and big and not tight fitting, it's rather loose, it's a perfect garment to use for layering up in the autumn and in the winter. It's an intermediate to advanced pattern and there are a few tricky things in this pattern, so it's a good idea to go and make a mock-up first or to try out those tricky elements before you actually sew with your main material. And those elements are the front welt pockets on the front of the jacket. Now it's a straight cut jacket and it's finished with bias binding around the neckline, the edges and inside. But it's got nice long sleeves. It's a very, very open, relaxed designed jacket and it's finished with metal fasteners on the front, metal magnetic fasteners on the front. So the other equipment you'll need for this pattern, excluding the fabric and the pattern itself, is thread, and this is 100% gossamer coloured thread. And of course, to fasten the jacket you will need fastenings, and we have here sew-in magnetic buttons, and these are by Hemline and they are sizes 18mm. There's 3 sets in each of this packet, so you'll need 2 packets for this pattern for the sew-along. We can move on to the fabric now, and I'm really rather excited to show you this fabric because it's such a vibrant, bright, fun print, and paired with the Cheryl Jacket it's just going to make such a showstopper of a piece. It's just fantastic. So this is Inky Grove cotton sateen quilted fabric. And as you can see, the print of this fabric, like I mentioned, is just beautiful. It's full of these colourful blues. We've got some light bright blues, we've got some purples, and they blend together well, of course the black as well. So inky appearance, watercolour, very, very arty, and they've got a subtle sort of floral appearance to them. And what's really nice is there's actually on top there's like these splatters, sort of spray paint type splatters, which just add a different texture to this fabric. So one side is print and the other side is plain, which I'll show you in a moment. But on both sides you do get the quilt pattern running through it, so the diamond quilt pattern. And this is highlighted by black thread. Now it's made from 3 layers of fabric. So we've got the 2 cotton sateens, one on the front, one on the back. And they are made from 100% cotton. And then you get the wadding in the middle, which is made from 100% polyester. So those 3 layers of fabric does mean that it's a heavyweight material, but it's quite thin for a quilted fabric. The feel of the cotton sateen, of course, is very soft, so 100% cotton, very soft material. But being the sateen, you do get a slight shimmer to it. It's not a full-on matte like a cotton fabric might be, but it's not full-on shiny like a satin would be. So the sateen just gives it a slight way of catching the hint. It's catching the light. It's less apparent on the printed side than it is on the reverse, which I'll show you in a moment. But it just gives it a nice little element, just the way it catches the light differently, especially with the quilted texture. So it's quite raised and yeah, it does catch the light in a very nice way. The wadding in the middle will mean that it's quite a warm fabric to wear, insulated, nice and warm, perfect for coats. So it's completely up to you which side you want on the outside of your jacket. So if you wanted a statement making jacket, then this side is definitely the side to go for. But if you wanted more pared back, then you could use the plain coloured on the outside of the jacket and then the bright bold print on the inside. So we can take a look at the reverse of this fabric now. So you get the bright bold print, and then the other side is a deep dark blue, slight hints of purple in this colour as well. Like I mentioned, you still get the diamond pattern running through this with the black threads, and you can definitely see more of that hint of a sheen with the sateen fabric than on the other side. Okay, so that's taking you through the Inky Grove cotton satin quilted fabric that we have, paired with the pattern and the other equipment that you need to make this jacket. So now we can actually get started with the Vikisews Cheryl Jacket. You'll notice that there's 2 lines on the pattern, and we need to use the inner line, so whichever size you're doing. And this is because this pattern you can also use with an unquilted fabric, but we have a quilted fabric, so we don't need to use the outer line. I've also traced this pattern out onto thicker paper. Because we've got such a bouncy fabric, the thin paper might tear, and I don't really want that, so instead I've traced it out onto some thicker paper so it's much easier to pin and cut out. And don't forget that we'll be cutting out on single layered fabric, so you need to reverse the pattern, turn it over so that you get 2 pieces for the front and then of course for the sleeves. We need to mark on where those pockets are going to be, so put one piece on top of the other, and I'll be using some really large tailor tacks for this. Tailor tacks are really large stitches that go through either the pattern piece onto the fabric or through 2 pieces of fabric to create marks on where the key points of the pattern need to be. You'll see that I've pinned the fabric together couple of times just to make sure that it doesn't move, and then I'll put the paper pattern on top. I've marked where the pocket needs to be on the paper pattern, and I've just pinned around that through all the layers of fabric. With needle and thread, I'll start sewing through the key points, and at the top I'll just make sure that there's a really big loop, and then I'll do this a couple of times, about 3 times, just to make sure that there's enough thread there so that it doesn't go loose. Once those threads are done, you can see the loops at the top. I'll just pop off the paper pattern. Again, nice to use a traced paper pattern rather than the actual pattern so you're not damaging it. And then I'll separate the 2 layers, pull the loops so that you're creating the gap in the middle, and there's the tailor tacks, and then I'll just cut through them, and then I've got the marks there for where the pocket needs to be. Use a contrasting thread, it just makes it a lot easier to see. For the pockets, pocket facing, welts and binding, we'll actually need a single layer of fabric. So what we'll need to do is unpick the quilted fabric so that we get those single layers. Generally, when I'm unpicking some sewing or some fabric, it's usually because I've done something wrong and it's a mistake and I need to sew it again. So actually it's quite a nice change to be able to unpick fabric for an actual purpose, and instead of because I've made a mistake in my sewing. So make sure that you unpick enough fabric so that you can cover all the pattern pieces that use a single layer of fabric. For the inside, we'll need bias binding, so you can either use the pattern side or the contrast inside for the binding on the inside, or you can stick with the plain colour. Now that I have all the fabric unpicked that I need, I can put on the welts and the pocket facing. Make sure that you get the grain line of the fabric right and also the direction of the print. From the wadding, you'll also need to cut out a pattern piece, and this is the welt piece. So take the layer of wadding, pin the pattern piece and cut around this, and then cut this in half, and you have the 2 pieces for the welt. Take one of the welt pieces and fold it in half right sides together, then place the wadding on top of that and pin at the ends. Stitch along those edges, back stitching at the beginning and the end of the seam. Then press this flat and trim away the excess wadding from the seam allowance. down to about 2mm so that you're just removing the bulk. Turn the welt right side out, pressing into those corners, smooth it out, make sure that those corners are really nice and sharp, and then match the long unstitched edges of the welt, pin and baste these and stitch on the sewing machine. Use quite a long stitch length for this, so about 4 to 5mm, because all it's doing is keeping the fabric and the wadding together. Those tailor tacks have marked on the front and the back the bounding box for the pocket, based along the outside welt box. Mark the welt box on the right side of the bottom pocket lining piece, and then place the wrong side of the bottom pocket lining onto the wrong side of the jacket front. Align the welt box markings and pin the bottom pocket lining in place and baste. On the right side, place the welt onto the right side of the jacket front, aligning it with the welt stitch line. Pin the welt in place and baste. Again, I'll use a contrasting thread so that I can see this thread when I go to remove it, and I'll make sure that those stitch lines line up correctly, and this is just by poking the needle through very, very carefully both sides so that I can make sure that those stitches do align. Once you've basted that line, take the pocket facing and mark the welt box on the wrong side of the pocket facing. Place the pocket facing on top of the welt, right sides together. Match the welt box markings on the jacket front and pocket facing pieces. Pin the facing and then baste this into place. Again, I'm making sure that this is as accurate as I can be by placing the needle through that first layer of fabric and then going through to the bottom layer, making sure that the stitches all align. Stitch the welt, pocket facing and bottom pocket lining together on the sewing machine. When stitching, follow the welt box markings on the pocket facing. The stitch line opposite the welt should be made 2 to 3mm shorter at both ends. This ensures that the pocket edges are covered by the welt when this is all turned through. Backstitch at the beginning and the end of the seam. Okay, so here comes a part that you have to do really, really carefully. It's always a frightening part for me, and that is to carefully cut along the marked cutting lines on the pocket facing and pocket lining. Now pay attention to the corners. When you're cutting the corners, make sure that you're cutting close enough to the stitching line but not through the stitching line. It has to be around about 1mm away from the corner point. Take your time because you are cutting through quite a few layers of fabric there, so make sure that you have some really nice sharp and pointy scissors. Once that's done, you can remove the pins and pop the pocket facing through to the other side. When you've turned it through, just trim away some of that excess wadding. It's a little bulky, so we can just remove a little bit of this and pin the fabric down so that it's not getting in your way. press the unstitched edge of the pocket facing to the wrong side by 1 centimetre. Then we're going to pin the pocket facing to the bottom pocket lining and baste this into place. Make sure that this lies nice and flat, so I've shoved quite a few pins in there just to make sure that the fabric meets nicely. Top stitch the pocket facing onto the pocket lining, stitch about 1 millimetre away or 2 millimetres away. Align the upper edge of the pocket facing with the upper edge of the bottom pocket lining. Match the edges, pin, baste and then stitch on the machine. We'll move on to the other pocket pieces now, so place the right side of the pocket facing onto the right side of the top pocket lining. Align the seam allowance line on the facing with the facing stitching line on the lining. Pin the facing in place, baste, stitch on the sewing machine and backstitch at the beginning and the end of the seam. Now you can press this seam flat and then fold the pocket facing over to the right side and press again. Give this a quick press with the iron and then top stitch once again with a 1 to 2 millimetre seam along the join of the fabrics. On the right side, this is the wrong side, but on the right side, pin down the welt because we don't want that to be getting in the way. Then back on the wrong side, place the top pocket lining and the bottom pocket lining wrong sides together. Line all the edges except the upper edge, pin and baste this into place. It does get a bit fiddly at this point, especially when you reach the top edges, but just play around, give it a bit of a wiggle and make sure that they're pinned up and aligned nicely. So now we can stitch this, so stitch the 2 lining pieces together on the sewing machine 5 millimeters away from the edge, and don't forget to back stitch once again at the beginning and the end of the seam. Okay, turn the lining through the pocket opening to the right side and align the upper edges of the pocket facing and top pocket lining. Pin these together. Then stitch the edges on the sewing machine 5 millimeters away from the edge. Don't forget at each point when we're sewing to press the seams flat, it really does make a difference. Pull the pocket out and you'll see the raw edge there of the pocket. Trim this down to about 3 millimeters. And press out that edge really nice and flat. What we're kind of doing is creating a French seam for this pocket, so we're putting all the wrong edges on the inside, and that's inside the seam allowance. So once you've turned the pocket, pin it and give it a press as well, and then we'll go and stitch this on the machine. I want to sew about 5 millimeters away from the edge, and this just makes sure that there's no threads poking through the seam allowance. Pin the pocket lining along the upper and side stitch lines of the pocket box, and then machine stitch along the upper and side stitch lines of the pocket box. Follow the pocket box stitch lines exactly and backstitch at the beginning and the end of the seam. From the right side, pin the ends of the welt in place, baste these, it really does help to baste these down first, and then stitch on the sewing machine and stitch about 2mm away from the edge. We can move on now to the actual construction of the jacket. So place the jacket front and back pieces right sides together, aligning the shoulder edges, and match the edges, pin them, baste them, and then stitch on the sewing machine. It's important to press these seams once you've sewn them because the 2 layers of wadding can make it a little bit bulky. So take an iron and run it over top the seam allowance. So don't go any further than the stitch line. And you can see there the difference between an unironed piece and then the ironed piece, and it just helps flatten it down. We'll need to create some bias strips now, so this is from the lining fabric. They need to be 4 centimeters wide and they need to be cut on a 45-degree angle. Once they're stitched together, take the bias strips and fold them in half and iron them. The wrong sides need to be facing each other. And then take one side, fold one of the raw edges into the middle and press once again. So you only need to do this for one side of the bias strips. Align the unpressed edge of the binding with the edge of the shoulder seam, with the right side of the binding facing the back of the garment. Pin the binding in place and then baste this into place, and then you can stitch this on the sewing machine. I like to leave just a little overhang so that I know there's enough fabric to pull this through the machine. You don't want to pull it obviously, but it just helps to guide it through to begin with. Trim away some of that excess wadding, not too much, you're just trimming the seam down a little, and then fold the bias binding over the seam. This will wrap over the seam allowance, and you want to pin this and baste it as well. Put the line of basting stitches in the ditch of the binding seam from the back, catching the folded edge of the bias binding on the front by 1mm. Change your machine foot to a stitch in the ditch foot, and then stitch the binding on the sewing machine, backstitch at the beginning and the end. You'll want to press the finished seam allowance towards the front of the garment. Place the sleeve and the jacket body right sides together, match the sleeve cap edge with the arm side, align the edges and then stitch. Iron the seam nice and flat, and we're going to finish this exactly like we did with the shoulder seams. So place the unfolded edge along the seam. This is on the bodice side as well, this isn't on the sleeve side. Stitch this, trim away some of the wadding, fold it over, baste it like we did with the shoulder seam where we put the stitches into the ditch of the seam, catching the other side about 1mm away from the edge. Press the seam flat and press it towards the sleeve. This will be the last bit of the main construction of this jacket, so you want to place the front and back pieces right sides together, align those edges, make sure that the seams match under the arms, and then you can pin this into place and then you can stitch it on the machine. And yes, we're going to press that seam flat, trim away some of the excess wadding, and then stitch the binding on exactly like we did with the shoulder seams and the sleeves. We'll do the sleeve hem binding now, so you want to cut 2 pieces of this. Make sure that you get that grain line correct because this is a bias cut piece of fabric. Fold the sleeve hem binding in half right sides together, and then align the short edges, pin this, and then sew on the machine. Press the seam open and then fold the sleeve hem binding in half the wrong sides together. And we're finishing this like we did all the other seams on the inside, where you're making the bias tape, really folding the half into the centre. Lining this up with the raw edge of the sleeve, sewing it, and then of course folding it over and basting it into place, and then stitching it the same way that we did with the binding on the inside. This is just to finish off the sleeve. Now that the sleeve is done, we can move on to finishing off the front of the jacket, and this is a really long piece of binding. So once you've cut your binding strips out of your main fabric, then line them up, sew them up so that you have one nice long piece of binding. Press open all the seams that you've sewn, and then of course fold it in half, give it a nice press, and then take that one edge and fold that into the middle and press that as well. Then with right sides together, align the unfolded edge of the bias tape along the neckline, front and bottom edges of the garment. So I started at the bottom of the jacket for this one. Stitch the binding to the jacket, and you'll notice that around the curves at the front I go really slowly, and this is because I want it to be nice and neat and have a really smooth curve. And exactly like we did, we're going to fold over that binding and then baste it. So there's my baste and stitches. You can see they're all nice and neat. I've made sure that from the right side I've stitched in the ditch, and then I've caught the binding about 1mm away from the edge. Again, taking my time stitching this. There are actual points where I turn the machine by hand rather than use the foot, the pedal, and this is just to make sure that it is as neat as it can possibly be. So it's worth taking your time to make this a really good finish. Moving on to the metal buttons, mark the placement, make sure that there is evenly spaced between all the buttons. And what we'll do is we'll put the smaller part or the thinner part of the button, magnetic button, onto the top of the jacket, so the side that's going to go on the front, and then the thicker part, the heavier piece, onto the other parts of the jacket. Stitch these on with some thread and try not to let those stitches go through to the other side, because we kind of want this to be as neat as possible from the outside. So I'm threading this between the layers of the lining and the wadding. Give the edges one final press once you've finished sewing the buttons, and this jacket is now done. That is the Vikisews Cheryl Jacket completed, and we've used Inky Grove cotton sateen quilted fabric. It's very soft, lovely material, and very nice to work with too. My favourite part definitely has to be that binding around the front to get that nice and even, to be able to stitch in the ditch all the way around. It's a very satisfying part of this jacket. So don't forget that the links to all the fabric, the equipment and the pattern you'll find in the box below. And if you've made this jacket or if you've used this fabric, then do post about it on the Minerva community. Tag me in it because I would love to see what you've made. So thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.